This memory still crawls under my skin, even though I was only 9 years old when it happened. My parents were hosting a Halloween party that year, so they decided it'd be easier for my cousin Liam and me to go trick-or-treating on our own. They figured we'd just stick to the houses on our street, and my dad gave us an old watch to make sure we'd be back by 9 p.m. at the latest. Liam and I were thrilled at the idea of being on our own. Our small neighborhood was close-knit and mostly safe, or so everyone thought, and since Halloween was on a Saturday that year, most parents were out with their kids. We set out just as the sky grew dark, pillowcases in hand, determined to collect as much candy as possible before we had to return. After hitting most of the houses on our street, we decided to head toward the cul-de-sac at the far end of the neighborhood, a spot most people avoided because the old Maddox house was there. The Maddox house was one of those places that gave everyone chills. It was a hulking, decaying Victorian mansion that sat alone, set back from the road by a long, winding driveway. No one had lived there for years, and it was practically part of every neighborhood ghost story. Liam dared me to go there and to knock on the door, but I knew better. "No way," I said, shoving him. "Even if I wanted to, the place is boarded up. No one lives there." Just as we were about to turn back, we noticed a faint light flickering in the window of the house like someone was inside. We froze, staring in disbelief, and then exchanged a look that said it all. This was way too tempting to ignore. Against my better judgment, we ventured closer to the house. The porch creaked under our feet, and the air smelled musty, like old books mixed with mildew. When we reached the door, I raised my fist, hesitated, and then knocked. The sound echoed through the house, and we waited, half expecting something, or someone, to respond. But there was nothing. Just as we were about to turn and leave, the door slowly creaked open. Inside, the hallway was dark, but we could make out the shape of a tall, old mannequin standing near the staircase. It was dressed in a vintage suit with a creepy, painted smile that had mostly faded over time. The flickering light we'd seen was coming from a dim candle set near the foot of the stairs. "Do you think someone set this up as a Halloween decoration?" Liam whispered, eyes wide. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely a murmur. My curiosity was mixed with a deep, unsettling feeling, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Liam, braver than me, took a few steps inside. I followed close behind, every instinct in my body screaming that this was a bad idea. But then, out of nowhere, the door slammed shut behind us, plunging us into silence. We jumped, and I nearly dropped my pillowcase. We stood there, frozen in the dim light, and that's when we both noticed it. The mannequin had moved. It was now facing us, one hand raised slightly, as if it was waving. Liam grabbed my arm, and I could feel him trembling. "Let's go," he whispered urgently. But before we could reach the door, we heard the faint sound of footsteps, slow and heavy, coming from somewhere upstairs. My stomach twisted, and I could barely breathe as the footsteps drew closer, thumping down the stairs one agonizing step at a time. Just then, the mannequin's head tilted to the side, its blank eyes somehow fixing on us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I backed up, pulling Liam with me, but he tripped over something on the floor. A small pile of candy wrappers, some of them crumpled and torn, as if they'd been there for ages. The footsteps had stopped, and an eerie silence settled over the room. That's when a voice, soft and cold, whispered from somewhere in the shadows, "Trick or treat." We bolted for the door, yanking it open and bursting out onto the porch, our pillowcases abandoned. We didn't stop running until we were back on the main street, where we finally dared to look back. The Maddox house stood dark and silent, the porch light out, and the door firmly shut, like nothing had happened. To this day, I don't know if it was just some twisted Halloween prank or something far worse. But I do know that after that night, no one ever dared go near the Maddox house again. There's a reason I still avoid Westfield Park every Halloween. This memory goes back to when I was 12, and every kid in the neighborhood swore that Westfield Park was haunted. It was an overgrown, desolate stretch of land behind an old cemetery, filled with twisted trees and rusted playground equipment. But what made it truly terrifying was the urban legend about a ghostly figure that supposedly roamed the park every Halloween night, looking for lost kids to lead into the woods. Of course, my friends and I were intrigued. That Halloween, my best friend Derek and I planned to hit all the big houses along Hawthorne Drive for trick-or-treating, but our other friend, Jake, had a different idea. He dared us to take the shortcut through Westfield Park on our way home. Derek laughed it off, but Jake was relentless, egging us on, taunting us, until we both gave in. It was nearly 8 p.m. when we reached the park's rusty, half-broken gate. The only light came from a dim street lamp at the edge of the sidewalk, and the moon barely visible behind thick clouds. Westfield Park looked even more intimidating at night, with shadows stretching over the cracked asphalt and gnarled branches twisting overhead. "You guys scared?" Jake whispered with a smirk, though his own voice was wavering. "No way," I shot back, though my stomach was tied in knots. The three of us crept through the gate and it let out a loud metallic screech that made us all jump. We laughed nervously, each of us trying to hide our fear, but the silence that followed was unnerving. No kids, no parents, not even a single car passed by. It was just us and the dark, empty park. About halfway through, we noticed something odd near the edge of the playground. A pile of old, tattered Halloween decorations. There were torn masks, broken plastic jack-o'-lanterns, and a few ancient-looking candy wrappers scattered in the dirt. The sight of them sent a chill up my spine, but Jake shrugged it off. "Probably someone's idea of a Halloween prank," he muttered, though I could see his eyes darting around the empty park. We were just about to head out when I heard a soft, rhythmic sound, a shuffling noise, like someone dragging their feet through fallen leaves. I stopped, my heart pounding as Derek and Jake came to a halt beside me. Slowly, we turned toward the sound, and that's when we saw it. A shadowy figure standing near the swings, just a few yards away. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in an old, tattered costume that looked like it was from another era. I couldn't make out a face, but I felt the weight of its gaze. It tilted its head slightly, and I swear it whispered, "Are you lost?" We were frozen, staring at this strange, looming figure. Jake tried to break the tension with a nervous laugh. "Nice try," he called out, his voice barely steady. "Is this some kind of prank?" The figure didn't move or answer, just kept watching us with that eerie tilt of the head. I wanted to run, but my legs felt glued to the ground. Then, in one swift, jerking movement, it lifted a bony arm and pointed toward the edge of the park, where a narrow, overgrown trail led into the woods. "Come this way." The voice was faint, like wind whispering through dry leaves. "Let's go," I whispered, tugging on Derek's sleeve. He nodded, his face pale, and even Jake didn't argue. We turned and bolted, running as fast as we could out of that park and back toward the street. I could hear heavy, echoing footsteps behind us, as if the figure was following us, but I didn't dare look back. We just kept running until we reached the sidewalk under the safety of the streetlights. Panting and shaking, we turned back to see the park entrance from a distance. The gate was closed, the swings were empty, and the figure was nowhere in sight. We didn't speak the entire way home, and none of us dared take the shortcut again. But every Halloween, I swear I can still hear that voice echoing faintly in the wind. I'll never forget that Halloween when my friend Jamie and I stumbled into the pumpkin patch on the edge of town. It wasn't one of those big, cheery patches with hay rides and cider stands. No, this one was almost hidden, tucked away on the outskirts, just where the rows of houses faded into open fields. It had a weathered wooden sign that simply read, "Pumpkins for sale," with a faint arrow pointing down a dirt path. Jamie dared me to go, so we pedaled our bikes down the narrow path. The patch was empty, save for a small shack and rows of lumpy, misshapen pumpkins scattered on the ground. There was something eerie about the whole setup, but we shrugged it off, laughing about how much better these pumpkins would look than the perfect, round ones our parents would have picked. We were just about to grab a pumpkin and head out when we heard footsteps crunching on the gravel. From behind the shack, an older man appeared. He had a tall, thin frame, a pale, wrinkled face, and eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. He wore an old coat that was too long, almost brushing the ground. "Looking for a pumpkin?" he asked in a voice so soft it felt like it barely reached us. His lips stretched into a small, tight smile, but his eyes stayed cold. Yeah," Jamie replied, giving me a sideways glance. "We were just picking one out." The man nodded slowly, never breaking eye contact. "These pumpkins are special, you know," he said, motioning toward the patch. "Picked them myself, in a place far from here. People don't usually come by so late in the season." Jamie and I exchanged a nervous laugh, but something in the man's voice made us feel as though we shouldn't be laughing. "Well, we'll just take this one," I said, picking up a small, lumpy pumpkin near my feet. The man took a step closer, eyeing the pumpkin like he was studying it. Then, with that same odd smile, he reached out his hand. "That one," he whispered, "has character." His fingers brushed the pumpkin's rough surface, lingering for a moment too long. We handed him a few crumpled bills, and he slipped them into his coat pocket without looking. "Be careful, boys," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "There's more to Halloween night than candy and costumes. Some things can't be seen under the streetlights." "Thanks," Jamie mumbled, pulling me back toward our bikes, but just as we turned, the man spoke again. "You know," he said, "you could always see the place where I picked them. The pumpkins grow better there." He motioned to a small hidden path behind the shack, one that led further out into the fields and into the woods. His smile widened, as though he was waiting for us to follow him. Jamie shook his head, mumbling something under his breath about just wanting a pumpkin. But the man was already moving, stepping into the path with slow, deliberate strides. A low fog had started creeping up from the ground, blanketing the trail in an eerie mist, and the air had grown colder. Jamie and I stood frozen for a second, feeling a strange pressure pulling us forward, as if it'd be easier to follow him than to turn back. Suddenly, the man stopped and turned to us, his face obscured by the shadows. "It's Halloween night, boys," he said, voice now barely audible over the breeze. "A night to remember. You never know what you might find, or what might find you." That was enough for us. Jamie nudged me, and without a word, we turned and ran, the pumpkin thudding against my chest as we dashed toward our bikes. We were nearly there when I glanced back, and my heart nearly stopped. The man was standing at the edge of the path, watching us. But there was something different now. Something wrong. His eyes seemed brighter, almost like they were glowing in the dark, and his smile had vanished. As we jumped on our bikes, I heard him call out in a voice that was nothing like before. Deep, gravelly, like a growl echoing through the trees. "Happy Halloween, boys." We pedaled faster than we ever had, not stopping until we were safely back in my driveway, out of breath and staring at the pumpkin I still clutched in my arms. The pumpkin felt cold, like ice, and something about it sent shivers down my spine. We left it in my backyard that night, too spooked to carve it or even look at it. By morning it was gone, and no one in town seemed to know about the pumpkin patch on the edge of town. To this day, no one remembers any man selling pumpkins there. But every Halloween, Jamie and I avoid that stretch of road, and I still wonder about the old man in the coat and the strange path through the fog. and what would have happened if we'd followed him down that trail. If you enjoyed this story, you might want to check out our other videos and maybe consider subscribing. It really means a lot to the channel and helps us build a real community of horror lovers like you.